Picture a diplomat's gift table 3,000 years ago. A gold cup from Egypt set beside an inlaid dagger from Mycenae, blue glass from the Levant catching the sun, ox-hide ingots of Cypriot copper stacked like hides of a great beast, a small tablet of clay with wedges pressed into it, carrying a king's words across the water. This was the late Bronze Age, roughly 1,500–1,200 BCE, a world of palaces and scribes, of chariots flashing on plains, of merchant ships laced from coast to coast like stitches on a well-worn cloak. When we speak of its collapse, we should first see what collapsed. The Eastern Mediterranean was a club of great powers with a ring of clients and cousins. To the south, Egypt, old even then, ruled from the Nile's green ribbon out into Canaan and the trade harbors beyond. Pharaohs posed in relief as gods in chariots, but their chancellery spoke in practical prose, inventories, grain quotas, lists of envoys and gifts. To the north in Anatolia, the Hittite Empire, Hatti, held a high plateau of stone cities and vassal states stretched like taut rope toward the Aegean and the northern Levant. Its capital, Hattusa, sat behind rings of walls and gates carved with lions and sphinxes. Inside, clay archives stacked on shelves remembered every treaty and quarrel. Farther east, Kassite Babylonia and Middle Assyrian rulers shared a broad Mesopotamian plain, old in irrigation and sharp in politics. Between the empires lay a necklace of city-states, Ugarit, Byblos, Tyre, Sidon, whose harbors faced west towards Cyprus and Crete and the shadowy shores beyond. Across the water in Greece, the palaces of the Mycenaeans crowned rocky hills, Mycenae with its lion gate, Turins with walls so massive later Greeks called them Cyclopean, Pylos with a painted megaron where the hearth smoke stained rafters red-brown. These were not democracies of farmers. They were redistributive kingdoms, ruled from storerooms and scribal benches. Linear B tablets, fired accidentally when palaces burned, recorded deliveries of oil and wool, rations for workers and rowers, the number of chariot wheels that could be fitted next month if wood came on time. A Mycenaean Wanax, the High Lord, stood at the center of a web spun by accountants. What bound this world together was not just ambition, it was logistics. Tin and copper, the bronze maker's metals, did not grow on the same hills. Copper came from Cyprus, Alatia in the tablets, the Taurus Mountains and beyond. Tin was rarer, dribbling out of Anatolian streams, moving down from Central Asia, perhaps slipping in by sea from as far as the west. The best snapshot we have of the network in motion lies under 60 meters of water off southern Turkey, the Uluburun shipwreck. When the merchant vessel sank around 1300 BCE, it carried 10 tons of copper in ox-hide ingots and a ton of tin, enough to make a palace's worth of blades and fittings. Its cargo was a world in miniature: elephant ivory from Africa, terebinth resin in Canaanite jars, raw glass ingots in cobalt and amber, ebony, ostrich eggshells, scarab seals, a gold scarab of Queen Nefertiti, and personal effects that belonged to men who spoke different languages and shared the same deck. Diplomacy ran on the same roots. A century or two earlier, the Amarna letters, fired when an Egyptian archive was discarded and later baked by chance, captured royal correspondence in Akkadian, the international language of statecraft. Brother kings, Egyptian, Hittite, Babylonian, bartered daughters and gold, swore oaths over gods, and complained about short shipments and the discourtesy of peers. A pharaoh who claimed to have gold like dust nonetheless asked the great king of Hatti to send a proper gift, not trinkets. Vassal rulers wrote more anxiously, "To my lord say, I fall at the feet of my lord 7 times, and 7 times the enemy presses me. Send archers and grain." There is something modern in the tone, status anxiety, supply chain headaches, and the small abrasions of alliance maintenance, if one ignores the cuneiform, the incense, and the oxen outside. Warfare had its own grammar. The chariot 2 wheels, a light box, and a trained team made elites mobile and dangerous. Egyptian reliefs show archers losing from chariots, reins tied at the waist. Hittite scenes favor heavier chariots with 3 crew, a driver, a shield man, a spearman, built to smash with shock. Training a chariot team took time and fodder. Maintaining it required bronze and leather. Deploying it required flat ground and a state that could summon and feed specialists. Behind the chariots came infantry with spears and shields, slingers who could break a line of helmets, and nobles who valued honor as much as victory. War could be decisive, Kadesh on the Orontes, where Egypt and Hatti fought to a draw and then wrote the world's first surviving peace treaty, or ritualized. Punitive expeditions, raids for cattle and captives, shows of force to remind a vassal whose seal mattered. At the palace's heart, specialization stacked like storehouses. Scribes trained for years to press wedges or linear B signs into wet clay. Woodworkers produced standard wheel parts by the dozen. Perfumers mixed oils from recipes older than the memory of the men who recited them. Smiths alloyed copper and tin, then hammered and annealed blades whose shine held not only craft but also the state's monopoly on violence. A palace commanded farms and flocks. In return, it redistributed food and cloth and protection to workers and soldiers. The economy was not quite a market. It was a machine with the palace as its piston and the countryside as its cylinder. Religion and image made order visible. In Pylos, frescoes painted goddesses with spiraled hair and bulls mid-leap. In Ugarit, hymns to Baal and El shared a city with letters about grain and shipwrecks. In Egypt, the pharaoh was a node in the cosmic cycle as well as the state. But gods did not manage the calendar, scribes did. Literacy was narrow and powerful. When a palace burned, so did its files. And when files die, memory shifts from logistics to legend. The sea connected and threatened. Crews read coasts by smell and silhouette. Harbors from Cyprus to Crete to the Argolid exchanged goods and gossip. Phoenicians, though that name belongs more properly to the next age, already manned oars and sold purple dye cloth. Canaanite merchants moved cedar and wine and grain. Storms and pirates were hazards calculated into the price of copper. Refugees were a different kind of cargo, families taken in war, resettled as labor, captives absorbed as slaves, the poor selling sons to survive a bad harvest. Clay tablets remember famines and appeals for shipments, a governor in Amar, a king in Ugarit, a ruler in Cyprus begging Egypt for grain. Such letters remind us that the age of palaces was not a fantasy of endless feasts. It was a high-maintenance system strung across distances and seasons. To walk the aisles of a late Bronze Age storeroom is to feel the hum of a great engine. Pith, giant jars line the walls. Clay ceilings record who opened which door. A scribe sits cross-legged on a mat with a damp board and stylus, adding tally marks to a column that has no zeros because the scribe has not needed them. In the Megaron, a ruler receives an envoy from far away bearing a gift that is also a demand. In the court, dancers step to a rhythm that started in a village and ends in the palace. Outside the gates, farmers prune vines, shepherds watch for wolves, and masons repair a crack in a wall left by last spring's tremor. This world had weathered shocks before. A drought's year, a bad king's decade, an earthquake's morning. It had buffers, warehouses brimmed after good harvests, vassals could be squeezed in a pinch, gift exchange could patch shortages with prestige. But buffers are not always balance. The very qualities that made the system hum, specialization, long-distance dependencies, tight central control, could turn sources of strength into channels of failure. If copper ships are late, bronze workshops sit idle. If scribes flee a burning Megaron, tax memory dies. If chariots rule the plain but enemies arrive by sea and burn the pastures, horses become hungry monuments. A web bears weight, until one strand snaps and the others must carry more than they were spun to carry. None of this is to foreshadow doom for drama's sake. It is to respect what fell. When we say collapse, we will mean palaces and their archives, trade cycles counted in ingots, and diplomatic circuits measured in marriages failing not piece by piece but together. We will also mean something less spectacular, literacy narrowing to household marks, administration shrinking to village councils, the long-distance taste of luxury replaced by the memory of it in a song. In the decades before 1200 BCE, the scene is busy but not yet broken. The Hittites and Egyptians sign a treaty and seal it with a royal marriage. Mycenaean rowers pull to the beat of a singer's chant, while a scribe logs their rations. Ugaritic merchants balance tablets that record debts in silver grams that may never touch their hands. In Cyprus, miners cut new galleries into a mountain that has already given the sea a fleet's worth of copper. From the perspective of a palace staircase, tomorrow looks similar to today and better if the gods are kind. From the perspective of a long coastline and a long memory, the wind is freshening, and distant sails do not all carry gifts. The late Bronze Age was not naive. It had engineers and accountants, drill masters and diviners, and a habit of turning problem into procedure. It also had limits. Climate could tighten belts, quakes could tilt walls, migrants and raiders could follow the same routes traders did, and discontent at the bottom of the pyramid could be counted, until the counters fled. To understand the Bronze Age collapse, we will need to see how stresses accumulated in the seams, inlet. Stand in the doorway of a late Bronze Age storeroom and you can mistake order for safety. Seals stamped and counted. Jars ranked by volume. Tablets dried in neat piles that total oil, wool, copper, and cruise. But the palatial engine that hummed across the eastern Mediterranean had the same flaw as any elegant machine. It ran best when every part arrived on time. The years before 1200 BCE show hairline fractures spreading through that order. Weather that would not obey calendars, earth that would not hold still, and bills that came due for complexity purchased on credit. First, the sky. Farmers lived by rain long before kings tried to live by records, and the land keeps its own archives. In cores pulled from the bottoms of lakes and coastal marshes, from Cyprus to the Levant, pollen counts thin in the late 13th and early 12th centuries. Fewer grains from olives and cereals, more from hardy shrubs. Speleothems in caves, stone drip columns that pick up oxygen isotopes as they grow, shift toward values consistent with drier conditions. Tree ring series from the broader Near East widen and narrow through the late second millennium with rhythm scholars can argue over. Together with lake levels and dust deposits, they suggest a run of arid years that came not as a single catastrophe but in pulses. Drought in this world meant not the desert swallowing fields overnight, but rain failing often enough that the buffer of full granaries eroded, village cisterns fell below the lip, and one bad harvest no longer followed two good ones. Palaces knew hunger, if not always as hunger by name. Letters from the Near East in the 13th century read like officials trying to plug the holes with couriers. A Hittite ruler wrote south for grain. His queen, Pujuhepa, corresponded with Egypt not only about gods and marriages but also about shipments and shortages. In one reign, Egypt sent grain north as part of a treaty friendship. In another, rulers along the Levant pleaded with neighbors. There is famine in my house. My people are dying. Ugarit, the harbor kingdom that sat like a broker between mountains and sea, asked Cyprus, Alatia, for shipments and offered silver. Cyprus, dependent on rain and mines, was not always able to oblige. Letters from Canaanite cities to their overlords mix the vocabulary of trouble, famine, brigands. The enemy, which can overlap in practice. Hungry men and soldiers look alike at a distance. Famine is not only weather. It is also a spreadsheet. The palace rationed grain to workers and rowers, advanced seed to farmers, and took in harvest as tax and repayment. A year of poor yield could be smoothed by stores. A second year forced choices. Which work gangs are paid, which ships sail late, which garrisons skip a month of rations, which fields are abandoned because oxen died and men were conscripted. Credit thickened in good times, debts rolled over because the crop would surely come in. When rain failed across a region, promises accumulated faster than grain. We can glimpse this not in one tablet but in their tone, increasingly transactional, increasingly urgent. Then the ground spoke. The earthquake storm hypothesis, proposed by geophysicists and archaeologists studying fault systems across the Aegean and Anatolia, argues that a century-long sequence of quakes rattled sites from Troy to Mycenae to the coast of Asia Minor. The evidence is not a single smoking crack but patterns. Walls toppled outward in consistent directions, ashlar blocks sheared from foundations, collapsed upper stories with no obvious burn layer below, rebuilds that look more hurried, and temples whose corners no longer align. Some destructions once blamed on invaders now include seismic signatures. Some clearly include both, a tremor that opens gaps, followed by fire and theft. In the Argolid, Mycenaean Turins show layers where quakes demanded major repairs well before the final fires. On the Anatolian coast, Miletus and other sites have phases where architecture droops. Liquefaction in coastal soils will do that, and then stands again, only to be taken by another hand later. No one quake collapsed the Bronze Age. But a rhythm of shaking across decades forced palaces to spend labor and timber on refortification and repair instead of lamp oil and oxen. It broke harbors, silted river mouths, and redirected trade to ports with luckier geology. Add to that a different, quieter tremor, risk concentrated in long lines. Bronze was a promise that reached across mountains and seas. Copper mostly came from predictable places, Cyprus chief among them, but tin, the rarer partner, arrived like rumor. A palace smith could not hammer bronze out of knowledge, he needed metal. The Uluburan cargo, 10 tons of copper, a ton of tin, shows how much bronze depended on a single voyage's success. When storms, pirates, or politics delayed 3 such ships in a row, workshops went idle. The chariot, the emblem of elite war, ate resources when it ran, and even more when it sat. Horses demand fodder in drought years. Leather dries and cracks without oil. A state that invested its status in chariot squadrons and bronze fittings had committed to specialized supply chains before the phrase existed. Within palaces, specialists multiplied. This is strength when taxes arrive and shipments land. It is fragility when an overseer cannot pay crews on time. Linear B tablets from Greece speak in the cool language of accountancy, but on the ground, ration arrears become anger more quickly than numbers become numerals. In some regions late in the 13th century, we see hints of social strain. Fortification upgrades that bite into town plans, refuges on heights, watchers on the coast, inscribed in Pylos tablets, not yet war but the wages of fear. The tablets at Pylos that list men posted along the shore are part mobilization, part anxiety. The state trying to extend its senses the way a man leans forward to hear a distant rumble. Even in times counted as stable, the club of great powers displayed a dependence that is easy to celebrate in hindsight and hard to manage in real time. A Hittite king needed grain from Egypt during a crisis, and paid back with daughters and oaths. A vassal in northern Syria needed Egyptian archers not next year but now. A ruler in Cyprus needed wood from the mainland for the mines, and in turn, provided the copper that kept his partners' spear tips from bending. A drought in one region could be patched by imports. A string of bad years from Anatolia to Canaan could not. A series of earthquakes along the Aegean coast might have been shrugged off if ships could bring timber quickly from the Levant. If the Levant, too, was short of rain and busy with its own repairs, the shrug became a wince. Some friction came from the very success of the palatial model. Hittite administration pulled provincial elites into the orbit of Hadusa. Mycenaean centralization tied local chiefs to the court. Egyptian garrisons and scribes turned coastal Canaan into a pharaonic spreadsheet. In good years, this meant amphorae in storage rooms and stable roads for merchants. In bad years, it meant resentment. Labor corvées extended, grain extracted for troops elsewhere, foreign overlords blamed for empty jars. There is no clear dossier of peasant revolt, but the fuel for it existed: debt bondage, ration shortfalls, and a sense that the palace counted better than it listened. Meanwhile, winds shifted at sea. Not every ship with unfamiliar prows and foreign helmets was a raider. Many were traders from networks that do not leave archives in clay, but in broken amphorae on harbor bottoms. Yet some fleets were armed, and in times of scarcity, the line between migrant, mercenary, and pirate blurs. Egyptian texts a few decades later will call coastal attackers and moving peoples together by a name we translate as sea peoples. Whatever we call them now, men whose home was a hull or a camp could exploit the same routes that once carried copper and Nefertiti's gold scarab. Technologies, too, were noises in the system. The Gnaw-II sword, a slashing cut and thrust weapon with a distinctive leaf blade and tang rivets, began appearing in burials and hoards across the Aegean and Central Europe late in the Bronze Age. It did not need chariots to be decisive. Infantry tactics that massed men with javelins and these new swords could break elite chariot units and then break the social order those units symbolized. Early iron, still impure and rarer than bronze, began to glint in inventories and grave goods, not yet a superior material, but a proof of concept that would eventually escape the bottleneck of tin. To say the system was fragile is not to say it was doomed. It had weathered shocks. After a quake, masons rebuilt ramparts. After a dry year, the court redistributed seed and wrote stern letters to reluctant vassals. After a pirate raid, a punitive expedition taught a lesson. But in the late 13th century, the shocks began to rhyme. A Hittite letter asking for grain, a diplomatic note from Ugarit that mixes famine and fear, a seismic scar at Mycenae patched fast, then patching again. A coastal prince who can no longer collect taxes from villagers who have moved uphill. A merchant whose ship missed the last convoy and will now leave in a month where the wind is worse and the sea is hungrier. Complexity makes life richer and failure wider. The palace could solve any one problem. The world had begun to offer them as bundles. Before we follow the flames in the historical record, it is worth listening to the quieter endings creeping in. A scribe dies and there is no one with his hand to replace him. A shrine's votive offerings thin, not because faith weakens, but because bronze is worth more hammered into a blade than poured into a god. A garrison returns late and underfed. A commander writes to the palace and asks to be transferred. He is ignored, and he opens the gates W. Imagine a courier running along a Levantan road with a clay tablet wrapped in linen and sealed with a tiny impression of a king. He will not make it. By the time he reaches the harbor, masts are burning. The third quarter of the 13th century BCE still looked like a working system. Envoys cycling between capitals, ships heavy with copper chariot teams drilling on parade grounds. But the seams we traced in the previous chapter widened into tiers. In the space of 2 or 3 generations, archives fell silent, harbor towns left only charcoal and broken jars, and the Great Powers Club lost most of its members. Start at the northern hinge, the Hittite world. The last Hittite king we can name with confidence, Shuppiluliuma II, left us a clenched jaw chronicle carved in stone, inscriptions boasting of campaigns against rebels in the southwest, and of seaborne fighting with Elashia, Cyprus. That a land power like Hatti was fighting at sea at all tells you how far the fire had spread. Earlier Hittite letters complain plainly of scarcity, grain short in the plateau, vassals failing to remit, royal appeals to Egypt for shipments. Pressure came from every quarter. From the north, the Gasca peoples had harried Hatti for centuries. From the southeast, Assyria regained muscle. Along the coasts of western Anatolia, towns with Aegean ties could no longer be held with routine threats. A few decades later, the capital, Hattusa, lay abandoned and scorched. Its archives collapsed into baked brick and ash. Who set the fire? Invaders, rebels, or the Hittites themselves on retreat, remains debated. What matters for the story is the silence that follows. The state that had managed treaties from Troy's plains to Syria's rivers dissolves into a scatter of successor kingdoms. Carchemish and the Neo-Hittite cities in the southeast, competent, even vigorous later on, but no longer an empire. Turn to the coast, and you will hear Ugarit's last voice. This harbor kingdom, broker to mountains and empires, left an archive that survived because the city did not. In those final months, clay tablets fired in the heat of destruction preserved a correspondence that reads like the minutes of a disaster in slow motion. One letter from Amurapi, Ugarit's ruler to the king of Alatia, Cyprus, is the most quoted plea of the age, paraphrased here to avoid the romance of exact words copied too long. Enemy ships are here, cities are burning, my troops and ships are far away, send help, do not delay. Other tablets list emergency shipments or orders to mobilize crews. In a merchant's house, metal hoards were buried under floors, bronze tools and weapons hastily stashed against looting hands, never reclaimed. Out in the roadstead, a small cargo vessel, the Ugarit ship, sank with its pottery intact, a frozen itinerary that ended under waves. Ugarit's walls collapsed into the kind of ash archaeologists love and scribes hate. The tablets stopped. Cyprus, Alatia in the letters, reels next in the surviving evidence. Shupalulima II boasted of campaigns there, Ugarit pleaded there for aid, and on Cyprus itself, late Cypriot centers such as Enkomi and Kishan show destruction horizons at the turn of the century. Later, new quarters sprout with different habits, signs of resettlement and transition. Cypriot copper continued to flow in the next age, but the old coordination that turned ingots into predictable bronze shipments did not. The island that had been a hub became a hinge between worlds that no longer kept the same calendar. Across the Aegean, the Mycenaean palaces that counted everything could not count on tomorrow. At Pylos in Messenia, the linear B tablets that survived the fire give us the only contemporary glimpse of a palace on alert. One set lists watchers on the coast, named men posted in strings along headlands. Anxious bureaucracy turned to early warning. Another tablet records rowers, the palace organizing ships as if the sea now threatened as much as it promised. Within a few years, the palace burned. At Mycenaean Turins, fortifications bear scars of earlier earthquakes and then final flames around or just after 1200 BCE. Thebes in Boeotia took its hit even earlier. Other citadels failed in staggered sequence. Not every destruction was identical. Some centers rebuilt in more modest style. Others shrank to hilltop refuges. In a few, life flickered on amid ruins while the old script, linear B, vanished from use. Literacy in palatial record-keeping was a job, and the job disappeared along with the employers. Were those fires external attack, internal revolt, or accident made fatal by stress? All three probably occur in the layers we dig. In Pylos' outreach to coast watchers, we sense fear of a maritime foe. In the sudden appearance of mass graves and hurried burials at some sites, we see panic. In the shift in weapons, more Na'i swords, javelins, and spearheads in quantities, new shield shapes, we see tactical change that favors massed foot over elite chariot crews. A palace society that anchored power in chariot stables and bronze-fed specialists found enemies it could not meet on terms it preferred. What of the sea peoples? The phrase that floats over the catastrophe like a headline. Egyptian texts are the source for that name, and Egypt's encounter with them belongs to the next chapter. But signs of mobile groups on land and sea are present already. For a century, Egypt had recruited Sheridan as guards and fought Lucca, pirates off its coast. In Merneptah's reign, c. 1208 BCE, an alliance of Libyans and named sea peoples fought Egypt on land and lost. In the north, Ugarit's pleas and Cyprus's burns imply more than storm and chance. The people behind those ships are hard to badge. They were likely mixed, displaced Anatolians, Aegean folk from broken palaces, coastal clans turned to raiding by empty granaries, mercenaries turned to migration by empty treasuries. Reliefs will later show feathered headdresses and bird-proud ships. Archaeology shows something more prosaic and more unsettling. Camps, knives, and pots in new places, and old pots in fewer. As empires faltered, their clients found themselves orphaned. In northern Syria and the Amuk Plain, towns that had been loyal to Hatti had to choose between Assyria to the east, hungry again, and local strongmen with enough men to claim taxes. In Canaan, Egyptian garrisons withdrew to coastal forts and then home. Towns maneuvered. Hill country settlement patterns shifted. New small sites, 4-room houses, terraces, evidence for communities reorganizing away from the coast and palace economy. Later texts will call some of these people by new names. For now, The mute sprawl of potsherds tells us the shock did not wipe life so much as rearrange it. The worst part of a system's failure is the cascade. Consider Ugarit. As long as Hatti stood, its Hittite overlord could intervene in disputes, suppress a neighbor, or at least send a letter with teeth. As long as Cyprus shipped copper, Ugarit could pay its debts and buy grain. As long as Egypt held Canaan, merchants could sail with predictable anchors. Remove Hatti, delay copper, pull back Egypt, add a dry year, and a city that has burned before and bounced back cannot this time. Multiply that logic along the coast and across the sea, and you watch connectivity turn into contagion. None of this rules out the oldest human explanations: ambition and hatred. People seize chances. If you were a highland tribe nursing old losses against lowland cities, the moment to raid is when the city's guards are away fighting an empire's last fight. If you were a vassal squeezed by both tribute and drought, the moment to default is when the courier is late and the hegemon's granaries are bare. In line after line of tablets from Ugarit's last season, we read the clerical version of panic. Send troops here, recall ships, don't be late, the enemy is at the gates. It is not poetry, but it sings all the same in the bones, a spree of converging failures. By the 1180s, the list of what is gone grows longer than the list of what remains. Hattusa is mute. Ugarit is ash. Nkomi smokes and then rebuilds differently. Mycenaean's palace is a memory. Pylos' scribes have been burned with their archives, their words preserved only by accidental firing. Trade thins even where it does not stop. In hordes across the Aegean and Levant, bronze tools and weapons are buried and not recovered, a sign that their owners did not come back, or could not defend the claim. In Cyprus, new settlers carve out plots with habits that look both local and foreign. On the coasts of the southern Levant, ceramic styles shift, ovens change shape, and pig bones appear in quantities that suggest new foodways, signals archaeologists will later read as migration and cultural mixing, perhaps ancestors of the peoples the Bible will call Philistines. One great power is not yet on that funeral list. Egypt staggers, then braces. In the reign of Merneptah, it still stamps victory in stone. A stele boasts of a 9 bows undone and lists Israel in Canaan as a people already laid waste, a tantalizing first mention in pharaonic text. A generation later, under Ramesses III, Egypt will face on its beaches, and in its delta channels, what it will call peoples of the sea, fighting them in set pieces we can still see in relief at Medinet Habu. That story deserves its own telling. The ships with curved hulls and high sterns, the feathered headdresses and round shields, the ox carts with families, and the lists of peoples many still debate: Peliset, Tejeker, Shekelesh, Denian, Weshesh. Whether Egypt meets a migration, a coalition of raiders, or both, it meets the wave at last. For now, stand on a hill above a burned harbor and note the pattern. What fell did not share one language. It shared a supply chain. It shared a military style that had turned chariot parks into badges of nobility. It shared palaces that, south of the wrecked harbors and silent palaces, one great power still had breath. Egypt had been here before, weathering bad Nile years, marching north to discipline a vassal, carving victory into stone large enough to outstare doubt. In the decades around 1200 BCE, the Nile kingdom faced the same wind the rest of the world felt: drought pulses, refugees on the roads, predators on the sea, and recorded its ordeal with unusual candor. The record is noisy because the times were. A first thunderclap comes under Pharaoh Merneptah, c. 1213–1203 BCE, son of Ramesses II. His famous victory stele, better known for the earliest Egyptian mention of Israel, also tells us something about the frontiers of the age. In year 5, Merneptah fought a Libyan coalition pushing across Egypt's western border. With the Libyans marched contingents named by the Egyptians as Sea Peoples: Shurden, Shekelesh, Ekwesh, units recognizable from earlier decades as both enemies and hired guards. The stony prose of the stele and accompanying reliefs trumpet a victory. slain leaders, captured weapons, boasting that borders were secure. Even if the event is told with pharaonic volume, the cast list matters. Mobile, maritime groups were already available as mercenaries to anyone with silver, or as allies to anyone with hunger. Egypt's brush with the main wave comes a generation later under Ramesses III, c. 1180–1153 BCE, last of the great warrior kings of the New Kingdom. The dossier is unusually rich. Carved reliefs at his mortuary temple of Medinet Habu, a long hymn of self-praise in the great Harris Papyrus, and administrative texts that leak the realities of a state under strain. The picture they paint is not simple invader-victim. It is encounter in the plural, on land and sea, against coalitions that look like both armies and migrations. Medinet Habu's reliefs, still sharp under desert light, show Egypt facing a two-front threat. In year 8 of Ramesses III, a coalition of peoples moved by land along the Levantan coast with ox carts carrying families and belongings, women and children visible beside warriors, and by sea in fleets of oared ships with high prows and sterns. Egyptian captions name them: Peliset, Tejeker, Shekelesh, Denian, Weshesh, names that echo later in texts and modern arguments. Some historians align Peliset with later Philistines in the southern Levant, Denian with a people dimly reflected in Greek myth, Tejeker with a group later anchored at Dor. The caution is this: identity is not destiny. These labels likely cover mixed contingents, some displaced by earlier destructions, some opportunistic raiders, some mercenaries now seeking land. The land scenes show Egyptian infantry and chariotry meeting the coalition somewhere in Egypt's northeastern marches, the traditional invasion route along the ways of Horus. Standards mass, archers draw, fallen enemies are counted by severed hands, a grim accounting that was both ritual and bureaucracy. The naval scenes are more vivid still. Egyptian warships, with higher freeboards and platforms for archers, rake enemy ships with arrows. Hooked poles and grapnels seize the bird-proud vessels of the attackers. The enemy's boats capsize under the chaos of oars and entangling tackle. Warriors in feathered or crested headdresses, round shields at their shoulders, are flung into the water. The artists want you to read the message: Egypt owns the river mouths and the delta channels. The Harris Papyrus, Ramesses III's long retrospective, narrates the crisis in royal register. I made ready the river mouth like a strong wall with ships. I caused the Nile mouth to be furnished with a strong stockade of ships, of barges and of navy craft, manned within them. I overthrew those who invaded from the sea. It also mentions famine elsewhere and Egypt's export of grain. I caused grain to be taken in ships to the northern lands to ward off famine. Whether every claim is precise is less important than the shape of the story. Egypt prepared before the clash, fought one great set piece at sea tide to fighting on land, and understood itself as a rare exporter of food in hungry years. Did Egypt repel an invasion or intercept a migration? Medinet Habu's art answers: both. The coalition's land column includes ox carts with women and children, signs of movement to settle, not merely raid. The sea battle shows war fleets, signs of capability and intent. Egypt could do what many northern states could not: concentrate force quickly at predictable choke points, use geography, delta channels, to advantage, and feed archers and rowers from a river that, even in lean years, outperformed dry hills. Ramesses III appears to have broken the coalition at Egypt's border and prevented permanent settlement in the delta itself. He then resettled some captives and contingents as military colonies on Egypt's frontiers, a tactic that bought short-term stability and introduced new peoples into the tapestry of the Levant. Egypt survived, but smaller. The same records that roar victory also whisper contraction. New kingdom hegemony in Canaan erodes in these years. Egyptian garrisons withdraw from the more distant towns. Forts that flew the falcon now fly memory. In the southern Levant, new material cultures thicken. Philistine pottery with Aegean traits on the coast. hill country sites with 4-room houses and terrace agriculture in the interior. The vacuum left by Hattie's fall and Egypt's retrenchment fills with a mosaic of small polities and migrant communities. Inside Egypt, strains show through the triumphal stone. In the later years of Ramesses III and under his successors, administrators at Deir el-Medina, the village of royal tomb craftsmen, record something unprecedented: strikes. In year 29 of Ramesses III, pay rations of grain arrived late. Workmen walked off the job and sat down in the mortuary temple precincts to demand their allotments. Officials scurried. The rations came. The papyrus kept the complaint. Tomb robbery trials in the following decades reveal further stress: conspiracies, shortfalls, desperate theft. The state that built fleets and reliefs also struggled to keep bread on artisans' tables. The Sea Peoples debate, animated for a century, is worth pausing over. Were they peoples of the sea, maritime confederations from the Aegean and Anatolia? Or were they mixtures of displaced coastal groups and landward tribes shepherded by opportunistic war leaders? Egyptian texts group names. Archaeology finds Aegean traits on Philistine pottery and in architecture, but also strong local continuities. A prudent reading is plural. Multiple groups, some coming by sea, others by land, converged in the Levant as the late Bronze Age system failed. Their interactions with Egypt ranged from mercenary service to assault to resettlement under pharaonic terms. Egypt's resilience has roots deeper than chariots. The Nile's annual flood, even when diminished, offered a reliable floor for subsistence. Administration, granary accounts, canal maintenance, military logistics had muscle memory. Borders were clear and defensible. The delta can be a swamp to an army. And Egypt's ideology, Pharaoh as guarantor of order against chaos, made mobilization a ritual as well as a policy. None of this made Egypt immune, only less brittle. The price of survival was steep. Reduced foreign influence, internal austerity, and a century-long fade from the imperial brilliance of the 18th and 19th dynasties into the more fragmented politics of the 21st. High priests of Amun in Thebes wielding power, royal authority diluted, Libyan dynasts rising in the Delta. If the Hittite archive ends in silence and Ugarit's in ash, Egypt's ends in a picture. Ramesses III losing arrows from a platform while enemy vessels topple. That image is not a lie. It is a moment. It does not show the next day, when officials counted severed hands for rations and scribes recalculated grain allotments for garrisons no longer stationed in distant Canaanite towns. It does not show the families whose ox carts were turned around and resettled as frontier communities that would grow into named peoples in later texts. It does not show the artisans at Deir el-Medina waiting for the ration scribe and deciding to make history's first recorded strike. Egypt's brush with collapse teaches two things about the wider story. First, the Bronze Age's end was not everywhere the same. One great power burned and vanished. Another fought, shrank, and persisted. Second, the actors we group as sea peoples were not a single wave but a surf, successive sets of movement and attack amplified by drought and network failure. In the north, they rode routes opened by earlier trade. In the south, they met a state that could still concentrate violence and food at the same point on a map. Behind the reliefs, the system's lights were going out. Palatial literacy narrowed or vanished. Chariot corpses lay in ash. Copper still glinted, but tin shipments faltered. New weapons and tactics rewarded infantry who could be raised from local fields rather than trained for years with horses. The age of the scribe taxed plow and palatial ration began to yield to smaller scales, humbler houses, and different chiefs. The next chapter steps away from battles to ask a broader question. How does a complex system fail? Not by a single blow, but by a tangle of losses, literacy, specialization, central stores, unraveling together. We'll enter storerooms left empty, scribal rooms gone dark, and fields where men with new swords learn to fight without the chariot's shadow. In other words, from spectacle to structure, the anatomy of systems collapse. A palace burns quickly, a system dies in layers. In the decades around 1200 BCE, the Late Bronze Age did not end with a single sword stroke or a single dry year. It ended because strengths braided together, specialization, long-distance exchange, centralized administration, turned into channels for failure. Take them one by one and they look manageable. Let them arrive together and they make a silence that lasts a century. Start with the network. Bronze Age prosperity depended on links: tin from far, copper from Cyprus, lumber from the highlands, oil and wine from the coast, grain from valleys, all moving along routes managed by officials who could promise delivery next season because last season's debts had been paid. In a network like that, outputs are inputs. A palace's ability to arm chariot crews depends on metal shipments. Its ability to collect grain depends on teams of oxen that must be fed. Its ability to pay rowers depends on last month's taxes and this month's exchange rate in silver by weight. Remove 2 or 3 nodes at once. Grain short in the Levant, copper convoys delayed, the Hittite capital no longer answering letters, and every account in a scribe's tablet becomes a question mark. Complexity buys efficiency in good years and fragility in bad ones. When historians talk about systems collapse, this is what they mean: not annihilation, but the rapid loss of scale and coordination across sectors that once moved in step. Administration failed first in the one place it could not afford to: memory. Palatial literacy was a tool of the state, not a public utility. In the Aegean, Linear B trained scribes to keep lists for the Wanaks. In Anatolia, cuneiform trained them to keep treaties and tax rolls for the great king. When palaces burned and scribal schools dissolved, writing did not migrate smoothly to households. It shrank, then vanished. Linear B disappears entirely. Hittite cuneiform goes silent. Ugaritic alphabetic cuneiform stops mid-sentence. Egyptian continues, because Egypt survives, but with fewer outposts to write to. In storerooms from Pylos to Ugarit, the lamps go out. Ceilings that once locked doors turn up in collapsed layers, scattered like dead bees. Archaeology records that silence with absences. Standardized weights and measures fall out of use. Seal impressions cease. Imported luxury goods in elite graves dwindle. The next pottery horizon is simpler and local. Workshops that had produced fine faience and glass ingots stop. Bronze hoards, tools and weapons cached beneath floors, remain unclaimed, a mute vote that owners did not return to reclaim what they valued. Maritime trade persists in places, coasting runs, shorter hops, but the broad circuit that made the Uluburun cargo possible thins to a thread. Economy reorganizes at the scale of a fence line. The Late Bronze Age palatial model was a machine that redistributed grain and cloth and commanded labor with rations. Its replacement is household and village. Storage pits and floors rather than ranks of Pythian magazines. Mixed subsistence. Barley, sheep, olives, rather than specialized state farms. Local chiefs and big men, whose authority rests on kinship, feasting, and the ability to mobilize neighbors for a terrace wall or a raid. In the southern Levant and hill country, new settlement patterns appear. Small sites on defensible ridges, casemate houses, long rooms built into walls that double as fortification and family space, terrace slopes that catch every drop of rain. In Cyprus and the Aegean, post-palatial communities build on hilltops and move within smaller exchange circles. Urbanism does not vanish. It contracts and changes purpose. Warfare changes the fastest because it has to. The chariot, expensive, specialized, and devastating on the right ground, had been the badge of elites. In the aftermath, infantry tactics and kits spread that do not require a palace to maintain. The Na-I sword, leaf-shaped, riveted tang, good for both cut and thrust, proliferates across the Aegean and Central Europe. Javelins and long spears, round shields on a central grip, crested helmets. These belong to men who can train on a hillside, not just to nobles with horse pasturage. In reliefs and finds, chariot core shrink or are repurposed. A battered wheel turned into a threshold stone tells you as much about status change as a poem. Fortifications adjust. Not only enormous cyclopean walls around citadels, but also small circuits around villages, towers on ridges, refuge sites for herds. The geography of fear becomes local. Technology stumbles and pivots. Bronze remains the metal of choice for edge and socket. Tin, scarcity makes that choice harder to sustain. Early iron appears more often, not yet superior in quality, often softer than a good bronze blade but pragmatic. Iron ore is more widespread than tin, and smiths can learn to work it with the fuel and skills at hand. In the 12th and 11th centuries BCE, iron is still elite in most regions. A prestige material, difficult to smelt consistently. By the 10th and 9th, in many zones, hardening techniques improve and iron tools begin to make economic sense. The Iron Age is not a curtain twitching open in 1200. It is a dawn years later, preceded by a long blue hour in which people tried anything that cut. Religion and story absorb the shift. Without palatial sponsorship, cult centers change hands or move uphill. Regional sanctuaries that later loom large, Delphi, Shiloh, high places in the Levant, gain or lose luster as communities renegotiate who feeds which god and with what sacrifice. Oral tradition fattens. Bards replace scribes as archivists. Myths that later harden into epic are told in houses lit by hearths, not in painted megaruns. We cannot hear those voices directly. We can trace the audience by the rooms, one or two large spaces in a village plan where many could gather, to share news, songs, and memory while the wind worried at the walls. A word about Dark Age, a label long stapled to the post-1200 centuries in parts of the Aegean. Dark describes our sources, not the people. Fewer texts and fewer full-town plans make it darker for us. For them, it was a time of hard adjustment and creative thrift. In the Levant, new polities crystallize. Philistine city-states along the coast with Aegean-style pottery morphing toward local styles. Inland hill communities that later texts will call Israel and Judah taking root with terrace agriculture and four-room houses. Aramaean groups spreading north and east. In Anatolia and northern Syria, the Neo-Hittite and Luwian states carve reliefs anew and inscribe in hieroglyphic Luwian. Assyria, quiet during the worst decades, regathers strength along the middle Tigris under kings who remembered how to count demons and taxes. On the sea, Phoenician cities survive and retool, cedar felled again, purple dye boiled again, letters simplified again, preparing to write the next chapter. Diplomacy, too, will be rewoven but differently. The Amarna-era Brotherhood wrote in Akkadian on clay. The next international script takes a shortcut, consonantal alphabets. Ugarit had already experimented with alphabetic cuneiform before the end. In the early Iron Age, Phoenician and early West Semitic scripts emerge and spread. They do not require a palace to teach. Merchants and craftsmen can learn them. A message can be scratched on potsherd and read by more than a handful. An alphabet will not rebuild a fallen wall, but it shrinks the gap between ruler and ruled, scribe and shepherd. The archive that burned at Ugarit will have heirs in ship lists and receipts on papyrus in Sidon and Tyre. If systems collapse has an anatomy, it also has a pulse of recovery. In many regions, by 1050–1000 BCE, the ashes are cold and a new rhythm can be heard. Assyria reconsolidates along the Tigris. In the southern Levant, fortified towns appear in both lowlands and highlands. On Cyprus, new quarters and sanctuaries rise with mixed styles. In the Aegean, geometric pottery and long-distance contacts return, timidly at first, more confidently by the 8th century. Trade reopens, not as a gilded procession of tribute but as cabotage. Short coastal runs, small cargoes, risk spread across many hulls. Ideas ride those waves. The Phoenician alphabet west, ironworking tricks east and west, styles in art mutating as artists try on new patronage systems. What about revolt, the bottom pushing back on the top? It is hard to prove directly, easier to see in hints. In the final layers at some palaces, burn marks lick storage areas with unusual zeal. The iconography of elite power, chariots, hunting feasts, falls out of fashion. Households keep more of their own production. In the long perspective, the post-collapse world is less hierarchically steep, even if still unequal. Its faithful servants now kin networks and local elders rather than palace departments. Revolt may not explain every fire. It helps explain why some fires were not extinguished. Modern observers reach for metaphors, blackouts, financial contagions, brittle supply chains, because the late Bronze Age world feels familiar in unfamiliar costume. The caution is to avoid monocausal comfort. Climate stress primed the kindling, earthquakes shook the shelf, invaders and migrants kicked the door, internal tensions held it half open, technology nudged tactics, and the network turned sparks into a general glow. The palatial order had few graceful degradation modes. When it fell past redundancy into reinvention. Stand again in the doorway of a storeroom, but now with the next century's eyes. The seals are gone. The pith are broken. In their place, a pit in a floor with grain for one winter, a loom in the corner, a spear over the door, a potsherd with a scratch that could be a letter. Outside, terraces catch water in thin soils, goats scamper along a wall someone's grandfather built when the big wall fell. The world is smaller, the noise lower, the danger local. But families eat, gods receive offerings, and children learn names that look forward as much as back. The Bronze Age collapse is not only a cautionary tale. It is an origin story for the Iron Age we recognize more readily. States that tax rather than warehouse, alphabets that carry speech more lightly than wedge-filled tablets, merchants who keep ledgers of their own, soldiers who fight on foot in ranks that can be drilled without a chariot park. From ruins grew habits that would define the next half-millennium. The camera can now pan across the reassembling map. In the northeast, a hawk shadow lengthens along the Tigris, Assyria stirring. Along the Levantan coast, cedar masts rise, Phoenician harbors busy again, alphabet tablets stacked by scales. In the hill country, small towns lock their gates at night and open them at dawn. Across the water, Greek communities stitch memory into song and begin the slow climb from geometric austerity to something like the world's next experiment. The collapse did not end history. It spooled out a new thread. When the smoke thinned, the sea was still there. So were the hills. The next 2 centuries did not rebuild the late Bronze Age machine. They assembled a different kind of world from smaller parts, leaner, quicker, written with fewer strokes. Along the Levantan coast, the old Canaanite ports Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, survived the fire by ducking it and learning from it. Later Greeks would call their sailors Phoenicians, the purple dye people. In these centuries you can watch them retool. Big palatial convoys gave way to nimbler cabotage. Short coastal runs, many hulls, risk spread across a network of family firms and city treasuries. Cedar still came down the Lebanon. Purple dye still boiled in vats that could be smelled a mile offshore. Glass ingots and ivory carvings were still traded for metals and grain. But the language of the trade changed, literally. A consonantal alphabet, distilled in the late Bronze Age and standardized in the early Iron Age, became the Mediterranean's most portable technology. You did not need a palace school to master it. A merchant could scratch a receipt on potsherd and be understood in Tyre, in Cyprus. In an island harbor no scribe had ever written down. Inscriptions like the Ahiram sarcophagus at Byblos c. 10th century BCE show the script already supple. Hundreds of humbler ostraca and seals, many now lost to time, must have knitted everyday deals together. In the next century, Greeks would adapt this alphabet to their own tongue, adding vowels. For now, its spread along Phoenician routes let speech travel lighter than clay. Tyre rose to prominence under kings who mixed commerce with construction. Hiram I, 10th c. BCE, remembered in later texts for timber deals with a Davidic court inland, presided over a city that turned harbors into vaults and alliances into piers. Further west, seeds planted in this period would sprout into colonies in the 9th-8th centuries. Kishan and Salamis on Cyprus now wore Phoenician faces alongside Greek. Almina and other North Syrian ports became bilingual markets. By the mid-first millennium, Carthage would be the most famous of Tyre's daughters. The template belongs here. Emporia first, colonies later, alphabet and cedar first, empire much later. Inland, new peoples and old names arranged themselves in mosaics. The Aramaeans, semi-nomadic groups who moved in the power vacuum after the Hittites, stitched together principalities from the Euphrates to Damascus. Along the river bends, Hamath on the Orontes, Arpad and Samil in North Syria, and by the 9th century, powerful Aram Damascus. Their language, Aramaic, spread with them and with trade until it became the region's lingua franca, a status it would hold for centuries. Aramaean art and royal inscriptions carved on basalt show a blend of Neo-Hittite motifs and local deities, proof that collapse does not erase memory, it remixes it. To the south, along the Philistine plain, a constellation of coastal city-states took shape, the Philistine Pentapolis, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath. Their early pottery Mycenaean IIIC style, locally made and architecture, hearths and benches with Aegean traits betray origins across the water. Their later material culture hybridizes fast with Canaanite ways. By the 10th century, Philistine cities minted their own power in grain and ironwork, even as they traded with Phoenician neighbors and sparred with hill country rivals. Those hill country rivals were themselves new kinds of communities. From the late 12th into the 11th centuries BCE, surveys show a burst of small sites scattered across the central highlands, hundreds of villages where few had stood before, terraced fields, cisterns, and the distinctive four-room house, wrapped around courtyards. Collared rim storage jars, community silos, and animal bones with fewer pigs than the lowlands hint at foodways and identities in formation. Later texts will call some of these people Israel and Judah. Archaeology's cautious prose calls them early Iron Age hill communities. By the 10th century, fortified centers appear at places like Khirbet Qeiyafa and, somewhat later, at Dan, Megiddo, and Beersheba. Whatever you make of the scale of Saul, David, and Solomon's monarchies in this period, the larger story holds. Post-collapse societies turned kin networks and farm labor into polities that taxed, judged, and wrote. Egypt, the old survivor, lived on but looked inward. The 21st dynasty, Tanis in the Delta, high priests of Amun in Thebes, and 22nd dynasty, Libyan-descended rulers, managed the Nile's resources and temple wealth, traded with Phoenicians, and occasionally projected force into the southern Levant, usually briefly. The big imperial footprint north of Sinai shrank to diplomatic toes. Egyptian scarabs and faience still turn up in Levantan layers. Egyptian war reliefs, not so much. Survival had become management, not empire. West and north, Anatolia's quilt of successor states, Neo-Hittite and Luwian kingdoms, inscribed their resurgence on gate lions and city stelae. At Zincili, Samil, Karip, and Carchemish, rulers carved in hieroglyphic Luwian and later in Aramaic, boasting of walls rebuilt and enemies cowed. Their art mixes Hurrian, Hittite, and local gods with new swagger, muscular guardians and banquet scenes for kings who ruled smaller but more personal realms. Some would be swallowed by Assyria's long reach in the 9th-8th centuries. For now, they threaded the uplands with trade and war in equal measure. Cyprus, Alatia reborn, rebalanced its cities in this new sea. Enkomi's star dimmed. Kishan, often with Phoenician sponsors, grew. Salamis rose on the east coast. The island's scripts shifted from the enigmatic Cypro-Minon to the Cypriot syllabary used to write a Greek dialect. Sanctuaries proliferated. Copper flowed again, crucial in an age when iron was rising but not yet cheap everywhere. Cyprus was broker, shipyard, and prize. Its harbors taught sailors from Tyre, Euboea, and the Levant to bargain in 3 languages. To the northeast, Assyria stirred after a long lull. The Middle Assyrian engine had sputtered during the worst decades. By the early 10th century, Ashur-dan II 934-912 and Adad-nirari II 911-891 began to reconsolidate the core, controlling the Middle Tigris, securing the Habur steppe, retaxing lands that had learned to forget the tablet and the lash. Their successors, Tukulti-Ninurta II, 890–884, then Ashurnasirpal II, 883–859, would push west to the Euphrates, north to the mountains, and plan a new capital at Kalhu-Nimrud with stone slabs that remember the smell of cedar and blood. Deportation and provincialization, the grim bureaucratic arts that knit the Neo-Assyrian Empire, were honed in these decades. The empire that would, in the 8th–7th centuries, redraw the map took shape here, as scribes re-inked borders their grandfathers had scratched lightly. Across the Aegean, Greece climbed out of austerity. The palaces were gone. The Dark Age label belongs to our sources, not to the people. By 1050–950 BCE, Lefkandi on Euboea shows wealth and reach. A large apsidal hall, the hero urn, rich burials with Near Eastern goods, imported jewelry, evidence of elite households with contacts abroad. Geometric pottery, at first spare and then exuberant with meanders and horses, spread from Attica and elsewhere. Communities organized around oik households and basileis local chiefs, not yet polis city-states. Euboeans and other Greeks began to sail again with confidence, touching Cyprus and North Syria, Almina a likely waypoint, and trading wine, oil, and crafted goods for metal, ivory, and stories. Sometime in the late 9th, early 8th centuries, Greeks borrowed the Phoenician alphabet and added vowels. The result democratized writing in a way linear B never had. A shepherd could read his name, and a poet could preserve song. Homeric epics, whatever their final dates and shapes, belonged to a world where performance and letters could speak to each other. Warfare's kit in these centuries tells a tale of practical men. Iron blades and tools moved from prestige to workaday, socketed axes, plowshares, spearheads, sickles. In many regions, iron was not yet objectively superior to bronze. Quality depended on smelting and carbon content, but ore availability made it the metal of growth. Shipwrights hardened hulls with better joinery. The outlines of the Phoenician merchantman and later, the Bireme warship can be traced on vases and reliefs by the 8th–7th centuries. Here, in the 10th–9th, the prototypes earned their sea legs. Culture did not wait for kings to permit it. In the southern Levant, small sanctuaries hosted local deities. Household shrines with standing stones and clay figurines stand in for palace-sponsored cults. In North Syria, orthostats, carved stone slabs, flanked new palace halls where rulers dined with gods who had learned Aramaic. In Phoenician towns, artisans carved ivories in a North Syrian Phoenician style that would later adorn beds in Nimrud, proving that even empires buy from neighbors before they conquer them. One could sketch 100 such threads: the spread of Aramaic writing on pots and walls, the circulation of new weights and measures, the reappearance of long-distance exchange in the form of small but frequent shipments, the way family tombs replaced royal ones as anchors for memory. Together they describe an Iron Age that was not a poorer Bronze Age, but a different economic and political ecology, decentralized, literate in new ways, open to invention, and, important for historical memory, better at leaving words ordinary people could read. It is tempting to baptize this rebound recovery as if the late Bronze Age had been Eden. In truth, much was lost. Scribal traditions vanished, monumental art grew rarer, and for a century many people lived closer to the edge of subsistence than their great-grandparents had. But recovery is accurate in a deeper sense. Communities regained control over time and risk at a scale they could manage. A household that terraces its hill and writes its measure on a jar is more resilient than a province that waits for a convoy that might not arrive. By 900 BCE, the new order was clear enough to name. Phoenician cities writing the sea in letters, Aramaean polities speaking the land's lingua franca, hill country chiefdoms weathering into kingdoms, Neo-Hittite states standing guard by lion-gated towns, Cyprus as hinge and shipyard, Egypt as memory and market, Assyria as a hawk's shadow lengthening, Greece as a choir clearing its throat. The late Bronze Age had collapsed. The Iron Age had found its feet. What remains is to ask why the collapse happened the way it did, and what we learn from a world that fell not to one enemy but to many small failures arriving together. Climate and quakes, migrants and pirates, revolt and new weapons, complexity and contagion. Each has a case. The final chapter will weigh them, not to crown a single culprit but to understand how systems fail, adapt, and become someone else's beginning. Ask 10 scholars why the late Bronze Age collapsed and you will get 12 answers, because the evidence is patchy, the signals overlap, and the word collapse tempts us to crown a single culprit. The safest conclusion is also the most useful. This was a multi-cause failure in an interdependent system. Climate stress, earthquakes, migration and war, internal tensions, technological shifts, and network fragility did not act one by one. They arrived together, amplified each other, and turned local crises into a regional break. Start with climate. Proxies from lake sediments, cave speleothems, and dust records point to pulses of aridity from the late 13th into the early 12th centuries BCE in parts of the eastern Mediterranean. Pollen counts thin for olives and cereals. Oxygen isotopes trend toward drier conditions. Written letters complain of famine. But drought is not destiny. It pressures margins, forces rationing, fuels migration, and raises the price of security. Where buffers were strong, Egypt's Nile flood, even diminished, still outperformed dry hills. States managed. Where buffers were thin, Levantan hill countries reliant on winter rain, towns emptied first. Climate, in other words, loaded the dice. Then the earth shook. The earthquake storm hypothesis argues for clustered seismic events along the Aegean, Anatolian fault systems in the period 1225–1175 BCE. Archaeology shows toppled walls, consistent fall patterns, rebuilds that bite, and harbors silted by sudden shifts. Not every ruin is an earthquake. Not every earthquake leaves an obvious signature. But a rhythm of shaking across decades forces palaces to spend labor on repairs, disrupts roads and harbors, and, crucially, creates openings, literal and political, for attackers. An earthquake that cracks a gate makes fire more likely. A series of quakes that crack a budget makes revolt less costly. Into this step people. Egyptian texts later bundle different groups into a convenient label, peoples of the sea. But the picture is plural. Displaced Anatolians and Aegeans, coastal clans turned to piracy by empty granaries, mercenary bands whose employers have vanished, families in ox carts following rumor, war leaders assembling mixed coalitions. At Ugarit, we read of enemy ships burning towns while the king's troops and fleet are away. At Medinet Habu, we see families inside a fighting column and a fleet that could coordinate with it. Migration, raiding, and opportunistic war are not separate boxes. They are modes the same people can move between in the same season. Inside the palaces, strain had been building. Redistributive economies can feel fair in good years and oppressive in bad. Linear B tablets list rations to workers and rowers with cool efficiency. The people who waited for those rations likely felt the temperature. Debt bondage, corvée labor, and requisitions feel heavier in drought years. Fortification upgrades in the late 13th century. New walls, hastily added bastions, signal fear. Watchers on the coast, in Pylos' tablets, signal it louder. Revolt is hard to prove directly, easy to imagine, and unnecessary to universalize. Some palaces may have burned by outside hands, others by insiders who saw a chance to settle accounts. Technology and tactics nudge the balance. The chariot, a symbol of elite military power, demands flat ground, fodder for horses, skilled crews, and bronze-fed workshops. The Na-II sword and massed infantry with javelins demand local training and iron or bronze at household scale. That is not a one-to-one swap in 1200 BCE, but the curve is bending. If chariot elites lose a few critical battles to more flexible infantry, their aura of inevitability evaporates. When elites lose relative advantage, social bargains have to be renegotiated, and some are violently. Finally, complexity turns shocks into a cascade. Copper from Cyprus, tin from somewhere else, grain from Egypt, timber from uplands, oil and wine from coasts. These moved on schedule because scribes and rulers had made promises on clay. Complexity buys efficiency. It also concentrates risk. When the Hittite state stops answering letters, a dozen vassal economies shudder. When drought pulses across Cyprus and the Levant, a dozen ship manifests go blank. When Ugarit burns, Egypt loses a broker who kept its northern clients calm. In network terms, redundancy was low, contagion was high. So why did Egypt survive and Hatti did not? Geography and administrative memory. The Nile is a conveyor belt of calories. Canal maintenance and granary systems had institutional depth. The delta's waterways are kill zones that favor a state with archers and boats. Ideology, Pharaoh as guarantor of Mot, order helped mobilize quickly. Egypt paid a price, contraction abroad, austerity at home, but kept its core. Hatti, land-locked and reliant on vassal buffers and Anatolian supply lines, had more seams that could tear and a harsher winter when they did. Timing, too, matters. Hits came in slightly different sequences in different regions. The hand you are dealt in one decade matters for the next. What about dates? The seduction of 1177 BCE. Eric Klein's popular title has lodged a clean number in the public mind, but archaeologists shy of precision know why. Destruction horizons spread across a long generation or two. Radiocarbon wiggles have error bars. Different sites experienced collapse at different moments. A good rule: think bands, not pins. The broader window c. 1225, 1150 BCE frames most primary destructions. Localized failure and recovery spread beyond that. Do disease and plague belong? Direct evidence is thin. Later pandemics leave clearer signatures, plague genomes in teeth. Here we lack such data, but camps, famine, and war breed contagion. Disease likely added to mortality and stress without being a first-order driver we can prove. Once we accept plurality, we can weigh the weight of each cause differently by region. In the Aegean, earthquakes plus drought plus piracy migration plus brittle palatial economies. In the northern Levant, drought plus debt plus predatory coalitions plus Hittite retreat. In Cyprus, attack plus restructuring of trade routes plus demographic churn. In Egypt, the same pressures arriving at a state with more food and better choke points. If causes are plural, so are legacies. The first is negative, loss. Scribal traditions in Linear B and Hittite cuneiform end. Administrative memory shrinks to local, monumental building pauses, luxury crafts retreat. For many, life becomes poorer, harder, and more local for a century or more. That matters. Transformation is nicer than trauma. Both are true. The second legacy is positive. Invention under constraint. The Phoenician alphabet and its West Semitic cousins democratized writing. You no longer needed a palace school to keep accounts or carve a dedication. Iron tools, once prestige items, become everyday in many zones by the 10th-9th centuries. Changing farming, forestry, and war. States re-emerged with different architectures. The Neo-Assyrian Empire built not on vassal treaties but on provinces, deportations, and roads. The small kingdoms of the southern Levant taxed terrace agriculture and crafted local law. Phoenician cities made wealth on hulls and letters, not on palace magazines. Greek communities learned to turn oral epic into written memory, and later, to invent the polis, a different kind of political machine than a Wanax's court. Third legacy is cautionary. Complexity without buffers is brittle. The Uluburun ship that dazzles us underwater is also a parable. 10 tons of copper and a ton of tin on one hull is efficient until it is not. Diversifying routes, storing more locally, training more people to read and reckon, and building institutions that degrade gracefully. These are the kinds of mitigation the Bronze Age lacked. The alphabet, in a way, is a social buffer. Writing leaves the palace and moves into the market. A fourth legacy lives in story. Later cultures remembered the edge of this world through myth. Greek epics' Age of Heroes, forged from memories of Wanax courts and hilltop ruins. Biblical memories of conquest and settlement told over centuries and anchored in Iron Age realities. Near Eastern lists of kings that skip names not out of ignorance, but out of disdain for interludes. The Dark Age label stuck not because people stopped living, but because our sources fall silent. Archaeology has softened that word, showing continuity and adaptation, but the silence remains instructive. When centralized archives die, memory becomes song, pot, and wall. We should also temper the temptation to see ourselves too quickly. Globalization, supply chains, climate pulses, migration flows, brittle networks, these resonate. But we are not them. We have different energy regimes, technologies, and knowledge about our own vulnerability. The Bronze Age collapse is not a prophecy. It is a mirror that shows how multiple small stresses can topple elegant arrangements faster than anyone expects, and how people, once toppled, build again with tools that fit the new hand. A final accounting, then. Did the Sea Peoples cause the collapse? They were one force among many, both symptom and accelerant, devastating here, resettled there, absorbable where states had food and discipline. Did drought cause it? Drought primed the kindling and made every other shock more dangerous. Did earthquakes cause it? They knocked out supports and opened gates to fire, especially in the Aegean and Anatolia. Did internal tensions cause it? Where rations failed and debt bit, palaces lost loyalty and fires were not extinguished. Did technology cause it? Not as an engine, but as a lever. Tactics that reduced chariot advantage made old elite bargains fragile. Did complexity collapse cause it? Complexity amplified every failure and spread it across the map. What fell was not civilization. It was a particular way of doing civilization, palace-centric, bronze-dependent, chariot-led, scribe-administered. What rose was not barbarism. It was a set of new ways, alphabets, iron, village-based resilience, city-states and empires with different logics. The late Bronze Age closed with trauma and invention. The Iron Age opened with thrift and ideas. If you listen at the shoreline today near Cache, where the Uluburun ship rests, the sea sounds the same. Under the surface lie ingots green with centuries, a cargo list written in metal. Above, the coast is dotted with towns and farms that have known other crises and other recoveries. History does not repeat, but it rhymes with an accent. The rhyme of 1200 BCE is not doom, it is humility. Systems fail, people adapt. New orders write themselves in smaller scripts that, sometimes, last longer.